Hello, this is Mr. Dip.
You shouldn't have picked up, but now, you have to listen. Behind every peaceful town, hides something unexplainable. Not every scream is heard. Not every person returns. These are stories they buried. Secrets they tried to erase. And now, I'm passing them to you. But be warned, once you start watching, you won't stop. This is your choice. Your dare. Your descent. Welcome to Dip to Dip. The deeper you dip, the darker it gets.
After everything that unfolded in the previous part, perhaps we're all left wondering, does evil truly sleep inside a person, or is it simply waiting for a moment of weakness to rise? When someone with the face of an angel can mercilessly slaughter the very people who once called him a friend, then where exactly is the line between affection and betrayal, between humanity and monstrosity? Personally, I believe death is only the beginning. Because what's more terrifying than the stabbing, the screams in the night, is the realization that no one saw it coming, not even those closest to him. And what haunts me most is this: he didn't just kill, he stayed, as if savoring the chaos he created, turning a place once filled with love into a blood-stained theater. In this second chapter, we'll dive deeper into the blood-soaked nightmares of the killer himself, memories so disturbing that even he can't face them. At the same time, the hunt intensifies, as justice stops being a matter of paperwork and becomes a battle of footsteps, sweat, and breathless pursuit, led by an elite special ops unit and one fiercely intelligent tracking dog. I ask myself, when cornered, does a predator finally feel fear? Can the darkness within still be controlled, or will it consume him from the inside out? What do you think? Is he running from the police, or from the weight of his own sins? If you're watching this right now, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss a single breathless second of this hunt for the man with an angelic face and a devil's heart. Chapter 2 of The Angelic Predator Who Hunted in Plain Sight begins now. And this time, there's no room left to escape. Christian Devlin lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his breath slow and shallow. Darkness wrapped around him like a shroud, pressing into every corner of his room. The silence was suffocating. He had been here before, this eerie, inescapable void between reality and the abyss of his mind. He knew what was coming. He always did. The moment his eyelids drooped, the world around him unraveled. The walls melted, the floor dissolved, and time itself folded into an unnatural stillness. The transition was seamless, as if he had stepped through an unseen door into another dimension. He found himself standing in the summer house by the lake, the place that had once been a paradise for his friends and him. But something was wrong. The sky loomed lower, heavy with an oppressive weight. The trees swayed in a soundless breeze, their gnarled branches stretching toward him like skeletal fingers. The air carried a thick, metallic scent, a stench of iron and something rotten. They were there. Evelyn sat across from him, her platinum hair cascading over her shoulders, her blue eyes hollow and staring into nothingness. Beside her were Isabella, James, William, and Charlotte. They sat around a wooden table, wine glasses half filled with deep crimson liquid, yet none of them moved. Their bodies were stiff, unnatural, dolls abandoned in a forgotten play. A weight settled into Christian's hands. He looked down. The dagger gleamed dully in his grasp, its blade coated in a glistening red sheen. Droplets of blood slipped from the tip, falling onto the wooden floor with soft, deliberate plops. His heart clenched. He knew this scene too well. Evelyn slowly turned her head toward him. Her lips parted, but the words never came. Only silence. Then, without warning, everything shattered. The scene erupted into a chaotic blur. Christian felt a rush of heat flood his veins, his grip tightening around the dagger as if possessed by something beyond himself. He lunged. Evelyn's eyes widened in terror as she recoiled, but she had nowhere to run. The first strike sank into her abdomen, a deep, unrelenting penetration that made her entire frame shudder. A sharp gasp escaped her lips. The second stab was quicker, more efficient. The third, final. Her body crumpled to the floor, her delicate frame folding in on itself like a broken marionette. Christian barely had time to process before Isabella screamed, a sound so raw, so visceral, that it vibrated through his bones. She stumbled backward, her hands trembling as they searched for anything to shield herself. But Christian was faster. He could feel her pulse against his palm as he seized her wrist, the warmth of her skin soon replaced by the icy touch of his blade slicing through flesh. James and William fought back, but it was futile. They were nothing more than prey caught in the web of a hunter who had already decided their fate. The dagger in Christian's hand danced with lethal precision, each movement a stroke on a blood-stained canvas. The scent of iron thickened, mingling with the crisp summer air. He stepped back, panting. The bodies lay in disarray, the last vestiges of life draining from their vacant eyes. Blood pooled beneath them, soaking into the wooden planks like spilled ink on paper. Silence reclaimed the space. Then, the whispers began. Low, rasping voices curled around him like fog, murmuring unintelligible words in a language only the dead could understand. Evelyn's lips moved again, but this time, words poured from her mouth. "You can't run, Christian. You can never run." A scream tore through the darkness. Christian jolted awake, drenched in sweat. His chest rose and fell erratically, his breath ragged. The room was deathly silent, save for the faint hum of the city outside. The shadows along the walls seemed to move, as if something unseen lingered just beyond his reach. His hands were shaking. It wasn't real. But it was. The ghosts of his past clung to him like a second skin, suffocating, inescapable. He exhaled sharply, trying to shake off the lingering dread, unaware that while he was trapped in his own nightmares, the real world was closing in on him. Hundreds of miles away, the hunt had begun. A convoy of armored vehicles sped down a desolate highway, their headlights carving through the pitch-black night. Inside the lead car, Lieutenant Carter sat hunched over a stack of case files, his sharp eyes scanning every detail. The evidence was mounting. The pieces were aligning. "He can't have disappeared," Carter muttered, flipping through gruesome crime scene photos, images of lifeless bodies sprawled in unnatural poses, their eyes frozen in the moment of their final terror. The vehicle skidded to a halt near a dense woodland area. The team of elite operatives disembarked, moving like shadows, their weapons drawn, their every movement precise. A young officer crouched beside a faint footprint embedded in the damp earth. "Thermal scans indicate recent movement," he reported. Carter knelt beside him, brushing his fingers over the disturbed soil. He felt it, still warm. "He was here," Carter murmured. The team fanned out, methodically combing through the darkness. Their movements were silent, their presence ghostly. Every snapped twig, every shift in the wind, every breath of the forest was scrutinized. Then, they found it. A mound of earth, uneven, recently disturbed. Under the glare of their flashlights, the soil bore the unmistakable imprint of something buried hastily. "Dig it up," Carter ordered. The first shovel hit the dirt, followed by another. The deeper they went, the stronger the smell became, a pungent, decaying stench that made even the most seasoned officers tighten their jaws. A scrap of fabric emerged from the dirt, stained and torn. Then, something else, something sickly pale and motionless beneath the layers of soil. Carter straightened, inhaling deeply. "We found them." Miles away, Christian Devlin sat in his dimly lit apartment, staring at his own reflection. Something in the air had shifted. He knew it. The end was near. The rain fell in thin, steady sheets over the towering skyscrapers of the city, each droplet sliding down car windows and pooling in the gutters. Somewhere in the shadows, where the streetlights failed to reach, Christian Devlin stood motionless, his back pressed against a damp brick wall. He pulled his hood lower, his breath controlled but tense. His sharp eyes flickered over the empty alleys, the slow-moving pedestrians, the occasional flickering of neon signs. He saw nothing. But he knew they were coming. The darkness had always been his refuge, his shield. But tonight, it felt different. Tonight, it felt like a trap tightening around his throat. For the first time, he was the prey. Miles away, in a high-security control room filled with glowing computer screens, sharp-eyed officers studied every flickering detail of the surveillance feeds. Lieutenant Carter, a man whose weathered face bore the marks of decades hunting criminals, stood at the head of the command table, arms crossed. "Christian Devlin has run long enough," he said, voice gravelly but unwavering. "Tonight, we end it." Standing beside him, poised like a coiled spring, was Rex, a highly trained Belgian Malinois, his dark eyes locked onto the screen displaying their target. His ears twitched, body tense with anticipation. Carter turned to Rex's handler. "Is he ready?" The handler gave a single nod. "More than ever." Carter exhaled, his gaze shifting back to the blinking red dot on the tactical map, Devlin's last known location. "We have one shot. He's a ghost, but tonight, he's running out of places to hide." A sharp command rang out. The task force moved swiftly, slipping into their armored vehicles as the city lights reflected off their polished gear. The hunt was officially on. Christian's pulse hammered in his ears as he weaved through the alleys, rain dripping off the edge of his hood. He had maybe 10 minutes, maybe less. He had to reach the abandoned overpass where his motorcycle was stashed. His fingers curled tightly around the knife hidden in his jacket. Not to attack, just to feel in control. Then, a sound. A low growl. It wasn't human. Christian froze. Rex lunged. A blur of muscle, speed, and teeth shot out of the darkness, fangs snapping inches from his forearm. Devlin barely twisted out of reach, rolling backward in the rain. But he knew. The dog was too fast. He had seconds. He ran. Rex chased. Devlin vaulted over a dumpster, ducking into a crowded street. A woman yelped as he shoved past her, disappearing into the throng of people. But Rex didn't lose him. A voice rang out over the radio. "Close in." Devlin darted toward his only escape, the subway. He flew down the steps, heart hammering, legs burning. The moment he reached the turnstiles, he leaped over them, ignoring the shouts of startled passengers. Rex jumped too. Above ground, Carter and his team stormed the station entrances, cutting off every possible exit. Devlin was trapped. A distant train horn blared through the tunnels. Its headlights flickered like a growing specter in the distance. His last chance. Devlin jumped onto the tracks. Sparks flew under his feet as he landed hard on the gravel. Pain shot up his ankle, but he barely noticed. He just ran. Across the platform, Carter stood still, watching. "Keep running, Devlin," he muttered under his breath. But Devlin had no time. Rex struck. This time, the bite landed. A solid mass of muscle and teeth slammed into Devlin, knocking him off balance. He crashed to the platform's edge, his breath leaving him in a harsh gasp. Then, another force pinned him down. Carter. The lieutenant wrenched his arms behind his back, his knee pressing into Devlin's spine. "It's over," Carter growled. Devlin struggled, but he knew. This was the end. As Devlin was hauled to his feet, the train's harsh lights flickered across his pale, sweat-slicked face. The air reeked of metal and sweat, but all he could focus on was Rex. The dog stood a few feet away, breathing heavily, eyes locked onto him, unmoving. And for the first time in his life, Christian Devlin understood. He was afraid. Not of death. Not of pain. But of being caught. Carter adjusted his vest, exhaling sharply. "You ran well," he admitted. But you know what they say. Devlin said nothing. Carter smirked, glancing down at Rex, then back at Devlin. A predator is always caught by a better hunter. The rain fell harder as Christian Devlin was dragged away, his reign of terror finally over. And as the city moved on, unaware of the nightmare that had just ended, one thing remained certain. Justice had won. The rain had long stopped, but the air remained heavy, carrying the lingering echoes of the storm. The city had resumed its usual rhythm, but somewhere deep within it, a mark had been left, one that could not be erased. A chase unlike any other had ended, and inside an armored vehicle speeding through the dimly lit streets, a man sat in complete silence. Christian Devlin, the predator who had once believed himself untouchable, now sat motionless, his hands bound tightly in iron cuffs. His pale face, devoid of its former arrogance, reflected off the wet window. His eyes, once so calculating, were now vacant, staring at nothing. The predator had become the prey, and he knew this was the end. Beyond the heavy steel doors, the world moved forward, yet every footstep in the hallways of the detention facility carried the weight of justice finally being served. No words were spoken as officers marched with quiet efficiency, their faces unreadable but their posture firm. They knew they had won, and that was enough. Outside, a woman stepped down from another vehicle, her frail figure barely holding itself together. Deep lines etched across her weary face, her hands trembling as she clutched an old photograph. The image was of Evelyn, her daughter, frozen in time with a bright smile that no longer existed. The mother did not cry, her tears had long dried. But in her silence, there was a quiet sense of resolution. The man who had taken her daughter's life was no longer free. A cemetery stood in solemn stillness as 5 caskets were lined up side by side, adorned with fresh white lilies. The air was thick with incense, the smoke curling around the grieving faces of those left behind. Families gathered, eyes red-rimmed, fingers clutching at mementos of lives stolen too soon. Evelyn, Isabella, James, William, and Charlotte, names that had once belonged to vibrant, living souls, now reduced to whispers of memory. The authorities ensured that the victims were laid to rest with honor, with dignity. Every ritual was performed with precision, every prayer spoken with reverence. Candles flickered against the cold wind, and flowers were gently placed atop polished wood. There was no talk of the horror that had brought them here, no mention of the blood spilled or the screams that had echoed in the dark. Only the hush of final farewells, spoken in hearts too heavy to find words. Meanwhile, in the grand halls of justice, the trial of Christian Devlin began. Every eye in the courtroom was fixed on the man who had evaded capture for so long. The seats were filled with grieving families, investigators who had spent endless nights piecing together his crimes, journalists eager to document the fall of a monster. The air was electric with anticipation. The prosecution wasted no time. Piece by piece, they laid out his sins for the world to see. The meticulous planning, the cold execution, the sheer lack of remorse, each fact presented like a nail sealing his fate. Photographs flashed across screens, testimonies were read, evidence was stacked against him. There was no room for doubt, no escape from what he had done. Christian Devlin sat still, hands shackled before him. His eyes remained fixed on the floor. He did not protest. He did not plead. Perhaps he had finally understood, there was no escaping the weight of his actions. When the sentence was read, the room held its breath. Christian Devlin, you are hereby sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. A collective exhale. A silent wave of relief washed over those who had suffered. Some wept, some simply closed their eyes, and some only nodded, acknowledging that justice had finally been served. But this victory did not belong solely to the courtroom. It belonged to those who had fought for it. At the Special Operations Headquarters, a different atmosphere filled the room. There were no tears here, only quiet satisfaction, a shared understanding among warriors who had emerged victorious from a battle they could not afford to lose. These men and women had spent months hunting a shadow, and tonight, that shadow had finally been extinguished. Lieutenant Carter stood at the front, surveying his team. His sharp gaze landed on Rex, the Belgian Malinois who had played a crucial role in bringing Devlin down. The dog sat proudly by his handler's side, his breath steady, his body relaxed but still alert. Carter knelt, running a firm hand over Rex's head. A silent acknowledgement. A silent thank you. And then, the applause began. The task force had made history. One more nightmare erased, one more predator caged. Medals were awarded, commendations given, names etched into records. But for these officers, this was just one battle in a war that never truly ends. Tomorrow, they would wake up and hunt again. Because evil never sleeps. News of Devlin's capture spread across the nation. His name was plastered across newspapers, flashed on television screens, whispered in coffee shops and offices. But beneath the headlines, there was a question that haunted every mind. How many more like him were still out there? That was the terrifying truth. He had looked normal. He had blended in. He had laughed, shaken hands, made small talk, all while hiding the monster beneath his skin. And if he had existed among them for so long, then surely, there were others. The government wasted no time in issuing new warnings. We must remain vigilant. We must be prepared to protect ourselves and those around us. Evil does not announce itself. It waits. It watches. And it strikes when we least expect it. Self-defense classes saw a surge in enrollments. Neighborhoods formed community safety programs. People no longer hesitated to report suspicious behavior. Awareness spread, fear sharpened into caution, and a new movement was born. Because no one wanted to be the next victim. And no one wanted another Christian Devlin to walk free. Devlin's legacy was not one of terror, but of warning. He had killed, and he had been caught. He had run, and he had been hunted down. He had believed himself invincible, but in the end, justice had won. And for every predator still lurking in the shadows, for every monster who thought they were beyond the reach of the law, this was their message. Run while you can. Because we will find you. And when we do, there will be no escape. A killer may be smart, but justice always has better hunters. And when the net closes, there is no escape. No escape from justice. A predator may be smart, but justice always has better hunters. And when the net closes, there is no escape. The storm has passed, but its echoes remain. The city breathes again, unaware that just beneath its surface, a predator once lurked, hunting in silence. Christian Devlin's reign of terror had ended, not with a dramatic escape, but with the cold, unrelenting grip of justice. The man who had stalked his victim so carefully, who had lived undetected for so long, was finally behind bars. But his story is more than a case study in psychopathy. It is a reminder of the reality we often refuse to face, that evil does not always come with a warning. It walks among us, concealed behind a smile, hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. Inside the high-security walls of his prison, Devlin now sat alone, stripped of his illusion of control. The chains on his wrists were not just metal, they were the weight of his crimes, dragging him into an abyss where no excuse, no strategy, and no manipulation could free him. His world, once carefully curated to keep him untouchable, had collapsed around him. The predator had become prey. The man who had orchestrated fear now sat in silence. The only sounds left were the echoes of his own misdeeds, playing on an endless loop in his mind. Beyond those walls, life moved on, but for the families of his victims, time had frozen long ago. Their grief would never truly fade, but for the first time, they could breathe without the crushing uncertainty of not knowing if their loved one's murderer would strike again. The burial rites had been completed, the victims finally laid to rest with the dignity they were denied in their final moments. The flowers on their graves, soft and white, stood in contrast to the dark, horrific reality of how their lives had ended. People gathered, some whispering prayers, some lost in silent sorrow. There were no speeches, no grand declarations, just the simple act of remembrance, the quiet recognition that their loss would never be forgotten. For law enforcement, this was a victory, but it was not a celebration. Those who had spent sleepless nights tracking Devlin knew this was just one battle in a war that never ends. The hunt for monsters does not stop with one conviction. Every shadowy figure pulled into the light only reveals more lurking behind them. But for one moment, at least, they had succeeded. The system had worked. The people who dedicated their lives to justice had proven that no matter how carefully a criminal hides, they will always leave behind a trail. And that trail, however faint, will always lead back to them. The public followed the case, captivated by every detail. True crime fascinates us because it forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth. Monsters don't come from horror movies, they come from real life. They blend in, they adapt, and sometimes, they thrive because no one is looking closely enough. Devlin's case sent a shockwave through the nation. He had lived undetected for too long, hidden behind the very normalcy that made him so lethal. If he could do it, how many more like him were still out there? How many more faces in the crowd concealed minds as twisted as his? The government responded with urgency, pushing for greater public awareness. Crime prevention campaigns urged people to be more cautious, to trust their instincts, and to report suspicious behavior no matter how small. Self-defense classes saw an increase in enrollments. People began forming neighborhood safety groups, vowing to never let another predator slip through the cracks. The case became a lesson in vigilance. Evil thrives on silence, on hesitation, on the belief that, it won't happen to me. But it does happen. And it happens when no one is paying attention. There was no redemption arc for Devlin. No last-minute confession. No moment of remorse. Some criminals, when caught, break down, their facades crumbling as they beg for forgiveness, as if their humanity had only been misplaced rather than absent. But Devlin wasn't one of them. He sat in that courtroom, his face impassive, as if the weight of his sentence was nothing more than another fleeting inconvenience. He had spent years deceiving the world, perhaps, in some twisted way, he had even deceived himself into believing that he would always win. But the walls of his prison would be his reality now. And unlike the ones he built in his mind, these walls were unbreakable. This case serves as a stark warning. Devlin was caught, but there are others like him. There always are. They move through society, unnoticed, calculating, patient. But if his capture proves anything, it's that no one is truly untouchable. No matter how careful, no matter how intelligent, no matter how well they hide, justice has hunters who are always watching, always waiting for that one mistake. And when it happens, there is no escaping the reckoning. Evil exists, but so does justice. And if this case has shown us anything, it's that the darkness will always be hunted down. What do you think about this case? Let us know in the comments below. Should we be more cautious about the people around us, or is this just paranoia? And if you want to dive deeper into the world of true crime, make sure to subscribe to Inside the Criminal World and turn on notifications. Because in this world, justice never sleeps, and neither do we.